Hello, and thanks for watching this video on importing data into Acumatica. So in Acumatica, if we go to our integration services, we open up our integration workplace, there are a few steps in getting your data set up. In some ways, it takes a couple of extra steps in Acumatica to import data than other systems you may be used to. Having said that, once you set it up, these scenarios can be used over and over again. The first thing we configure is a data provider. Once we have a data provider set up, then we create an import scenario, and then we go into our transactions area and we run that import scenario. So let's get started with our data provider. So in this data provider, we're going to give it a name and a provider type. This effectively is the file we wish to import. Now in this example, we're going to be importing inventory stock items. So this will be SKU list, and the provider type is the data format that we're using. So you can see Acumatica has many different options to choose from. In this case, we're going to use an Excel provider. Probably 95% of the data we import is in an Excel file. Now keep in mind, this is the latest version of Excel. It has not the XLS format, but the XLSX format. So if you don't have that latest version of Excel, you can easily convert it. There's some online tools that allow you to do that if you don't have Excel of the latest version. But you'll notice here you also have things like CSV, and you also have other provider types, such as HubSpot. So if you want to connect to HubSpot, there's an option there where instead of dragging and dropping the file, instead you would put in all your parameters to log into HubSpot. We have Salesforce providers, the same thing, API connection. You'll notice we have a generic inquiry provider. So if you've seen our other videos about generic inquiries and what they do and what you can do with them, this allows you to import data from other areas of Acumatica by using the generic inquiry that you've built or that is already built. Turn the page here. You can also bring in XML files, ACH files, and even make a connection directly to SQL if you have access. So we'll select Excel here and we'll save it. And then what we want to do is we want to drag and drop the file on top of this area, this dark gray area. Now, the other thing you can do is you can hit Files here, and you can browse and then upload. So what I'll do is I'll drag and drop my file here. And you can see it here. And then we'll exit. And now if we go to the Schema tab, you can see Acumatica gives you the different objects. Now when we're talking about a SQL database, this is all the different tables. When we're talking about an Excel spreadsheet, this is all the different tabs on the spreadsheet. So if we take a look at this spreadsheet, I'll drag it over here. You can see at the bottom we have, this was a QuickBooks file, we have the desktop export tips, which is pretty much useless, just has some information on how to do it. And then our data is under sheet 1. So if I minimize this, I'm going to select sheet 1. That's where my data is. Now just to go back to that Excel spreadsheet, keep in mind what we're looking for is a spreadsheet where the top row is our different headers. So we don't have a lot of data in here. This is going to be a simple import, but our top row is the headers and then our data is below. So we'll minimize this again. And now on the right hand side are our source fields. We can hit Fill Schema Fields. These are the columns that are in that spreadsheet, the first record. Now keep in mind I removed some of the columns I didn't have data for. So now I've cleaned this up nicely. You can turn off any of these fields if you don't want them inside Acumatica. So for example, maybe you have a column of data that you just don't want to bring into Acumatica. It's not necessary. You're not going to import it ever. By turning that off, unchecking this active, you eliminate Acumatica having to pull that data into the database for then importing. So it can save some of the performance. Also keep in mind that we have the ability to change the field type. So if we need these fields to be converted, that's certainly a possibility. Normally we leave this as string and we let Acumatica take care of it during the import process or through our import scenario, which we're going to show next. So now that we have our data provider set up, we'll then move over to our import scenario. We'll open it up in another tab. And the first thing we're going to do is give it an import scenario name. Sometimes you could use the same name as your data provider if your data provider is for this single function. So just to roll back for a second, when we create our data provider, this can be used for many different import scenarios, not just this one. This is a set of data that I plan on using in an import scenario or import scenarios. I can continue to link back to it for as often as I need to. So again, this case, we're going to say import SKU. The next field is the screen name. So if I do a lookup here, this is in fact every screen in Acumatica. I can import to any screen or export from any screen in Acumatica. So we're looking at the screen ID, the workspaces, the category. So all of these show up in various areas of Acumatica. Now if we go over to inventory and we take a look, you can see under the inventory workspace, we have inventory transactions, automated operations, profiles. So what we're looking for here is inventory profiles, stock items. So if we go back and we search for stock items, you can see it right here. Now, our results returned two different options here. One of them has a PL after it. That denotes a primary list. So when we're looking at Acumatica and we want to go into, we'll do it here, a stock item. Click on stock item. Acumatica gives us a list of all our stock items. This is a generic inquiry or a primary list. You can see the screen name here at the end of the URL. So inventory 2025 PL. Now if I open up a particular item, this is the profile screen, and you can see here the screen ID is inventory 202500. This is how you determine what screen you're going to. The other way you can do it is to click on the tools menu and you could see the screen up here at the top, IN 202500. We import to profile screens. We don't import to generic inquiries. So keep that in mind that when we're importing, this screen is what we're using to map to. Now if we go back to our import scenarios, so we're going to select this particular screen to import over to. So that's the screen name. So we got our name and our screen name for the import scenario, screen name for the screen that we're importing to. Our provider is going to be the one we just created, the data provider, which was called SKU list. So now the provider comes up, and also notice Acumatica lets you select the provider object. So again, there's only one here active. We go back to our data provider, you can see we only made one active. But in keeping with the scheme of, hey, I can use this data provider over and over again, I may have a spreadsheet or a SQL database with multiple tables that are active. And when I go to create different import scenarios linking back to this one data provider, I have the ability to choose different provider objects, in this case tabs, to import different data sets. So that's why we have the provider objects separated. So over here is our sync type. Now full imports your records over and over again from the data source. Now in Acumatica, and you're going to see this soon, as we start to map this out, notice that in our stock items profile, we have all our fields that we can import. In Acumatica, the inventory ID in this case is the key field. So if I were to create a new record and I were to type in con chair 1, and then I were to move to the next field, Acumatica pulls up the existing record. So now we're in modify record mode as opposed to create new one. If I were to say con chair 6, Acumatica treats it as a new record. The point I'm making here is that when you import in Acumatica, if the data source has a key field that is brand new, Acumatica will bring in that new record. If it finds an existing SKU, inventory ID, then it's going to modify that existing record. So the point is that if you are importing into the inventory ID with your own values, then you don't have to worry about creating duplicate records. If, for example, I had my inventory ID to auto-sequence, and that's possible in Acumatica, then you do have to worry and you have to look at this sync type carefully. So full will always import the source records every time. All records will import if that field has been modified since the last time you ran the import, it will bring in that record again. And incremental new only means I will only do it if there's new records that I haven't seen before. So that's what the sync type is. Ordinarily, we always create our data sets in such a way where we just use full. And we're careful to not import over. But again, if you start to use auto sequence, you want to keep a close look at the sync type to make sure that you don't create duplicate records. Now, a few other things here. We have the ability to make this active, of course. Turn it off, turn it on, active. We can make this visible in the user interface. So if you've seen our other video, 2020 video import scenario improvements, we go into detail how you can use this import scenario and place it anywhere in the sitemap so that you can access it over and over again for convenience. So we won't go into that, but if you turn that on, you'll fill out the sitemap title and the workspace category where you want it to be in the menu. So now let's start mapping. So we'll hit the plus button here. We'll add a new mapping record. And the first thing we want to do is map the key field for our profile screen. So again, we're importing to the stock item screen. So I always like to view that screen and take a look at it, which is right here, so we can navigate through this screen and get a good understanding of what we're importing to and what fields are needed. So the first field, as I said, is the key field. That's the inventory ID. So that's important. So let's select, first off, the object. So these are the different objects within the profile screen. So there's typically always a summary. The summary is this area all the way at the top. From the inventory ID, item status, description, work group, and product manager, everything above the tabs. You also can import notes and those kinds of things. So all of these fields are found under the stock item summary. So now when we go over to our fields, you will see all of those different fields. Inventory ID, description. We scroll down, item status, notes. Our ability to set up pop-up notes and that kind of thing. Product manager. So all of the fields that don't have this greater than on them, these are all the static fields that are part of the summary area of the inventory profile. So the first thing we're going to do is map our inventory ID. So again, this is the target area and this is our source. Now notice Acumatica puts some action language in there. This gives Acumatica the ability to handle this as and when the data is inputted. So keep in mind, when Acumatica imports, it's not just writing directly to the database, it's keying it in with all the business logic you would key it in with a keyboard, which is why you'll see these actions here. So the inventory ID will map it to our item. Then we'll map our description. Now we need the price and the cost. So if we click over here under stock item summary, we need to figure out where that information is. And again, if I go to the stock item profile, that really gives me a good idea of how the screen is laid out. So if I go to price cost info, I can see that my cost is laid out here and my default price is here. So let's start off with the price. So we'll go to price cost, which is under price management, and we'll select default price, and we'll select price here. Now we need to do the cost. Before we do that, you'll notice our last cost, which is what we're going to import to, is grayed out. And the reason for that is because Acumatica doesn't know what we're doing as far as the valuation method. So under a standard valuation, we may use the pending cost and update it accordingly. But in this case, we want to have the last cost. So if we go back over to our general settings and we pick an item class can bring in the defaults for us. So if we select one of the item classes, this will fill out this inventory profile with some of the information. The valuation method is average. Now, if we go back over to price cost, you'll notice last cost is still not enabled. Pending cost got disabled, no problem, but last cost is not enabled yet. What needs to happen here is we need to hit the save button to get this field to open up so that we can insert data into it. So getting back to our import scenario, one more thing before I get over there. Notice the item class filled in a lot of fields that we don't have to. If you remember from our import file, we don't have all these fields of information in our spreadsheet. So either we can populate our spreadsheet to put all these fields of information in there, or we can use an item class that has all this information in it, and Acumatica will fill it in during the import process. So to recap, we need to get this field so that it's no longer read-only. To do that, we need to get the valuation method set up, and to do that, we're going to get the item class configured. So we're going to go back to our import scenario and fill out all this information. So we'll go back. The next thing we want to do is fill our item class. So we'll go back to General Settings, Item Defaults. We'll choose Item Class, and the value we want is this one right here. The next thing we need to do is to save. So in the middle, that's right, in the middle of importing, we're going to fire a save command. So if we go back to Stock Item Summary and we scroll down through all of our fields, you will start to see in greater than, less than symbols, the actions. So yes, in the middle of importing, we can fire off different actions. Action save, of course, is what we want at the end. In this case, we're going to put it right here because we need to save it once in order to get that last cost field to no longer become read-only. But you notice that all the actions that are part of that profile screen are there. So the ability to delete, for example, maybe we import all our records and later realize we want to delete them and import them again. All we need is the SKU and an action delete. We can delete everything in the table. So we'll use action save here. Then we'll go back to our price, cost statistics, last cost, and that'll equal our cost field. And again, at the end, we want to go back and save this. So stock item summary and another action save. Okay, we'll save this. You notice the commit checkbox. So what commit does, it's automatically selected for every field that's needed. But what this does is this actually forces Acumatica to go back to the server, check things out, and then return a response to the user interface. In some cases, that's not necessary. We don't want to do that every time because it can really slow down performance. But having said that, when you're tabbing through here and you're filling out information, some fields will make Acumatica's user interface change. So for example, this consumer item class, when we change this, notice Acumatica's committed this because it wants to get these fields filled out in the form prior to getting everything finished. So that's why you have a commit there. But other changes to this form, other values that we import, may in fact actually change the user interface and make fields also enabled. So for example, automatic packaging, if I change that by weight to manual, notice the form changes. And back again, it changes again. So these are the kinds of things that you would want to commit so that the server can go back, understand its business logic, and then change the screen accordingly. So then we can import data to those changed fields. So we'll go back to our import scenario. Everything looks good here. We'll go to the transaction import by scenario. We'll open up our import scenario, the one we created. And getting to know this screen, there's a prepare and import button. So what this does is it loads the data from the spreadsheet or the file, the data file in the provider, and it fires the import. So it brings the data in and then imports it. These options over here give you the ability to prepare, bring the data in, and then once you've looked at it, run an import. So the grid below gives us the ability to look at all the data before it gets imported into Acumatica. This data will be saved in Acumatica in a different section, but it gives you the ability to take a look at the data specifically and make changes too. If I see a problem, an anomaly, I can see the error as I import and maybe make a last minute change right in this grid without having to go back to my spreadsheet. So this could be very helpful. You have other options here. Break on error means, do I want the system to stop every time there's an error? Or do I want it to just keep going and just report the error so then I can look at them later? Break on incorrect target will return an error for the very first record that violates target restrictions. And discard previous result will remove all of the existing records here the next time you run your import process. Lastly, and new for 2020 R1, Acumatica now has parallel processing, which can improve performance. Now you can't turn that on here. Instead, we would turn that on over in our import scenario when we defined it. Notice that break on error and break on incorrect target are no longer possible because Acumatica is going through and multi-threading, basically creating multiple tasks in order to import this data. So if we save this, there's no break on error anymore. So down below we have a couple of columns. Active indicates that when we run the import, we're going to import these active records. So Acumatica gives you the ability to turn that off and on. So if you wanted to, for example, when you have large record sets or even just, a couple hundred records, you may want to turn off active and just check off a couple of records to see how this looks. So what we do is we do that. We select those two records, hit the save button, and then we run import. Now we can take a look at these and see what they look like. So now we'll import. And you can see we successfully processed two records. That's what this other column. This other column gives you the indication of what records are done. So again, when you're dealing with a lot of records, it's nice to know what successfully imported. If you wanted something to get imported again, you can simply uncheck it. And because it's still active, if we run import, this will get imported again. As we talked about earlier, because this item already exists, it's only going to edit. It's because this item SKU is a key field, and the item SKU is going to go into edit mode. So any of these changes that we make here, if I change this to $26, rerun this, it will automatically just modify the record, not create a duplicate. So let's take a look at this item and see what it looks like. And you could see the item we imported. Notice all the valuation method and the tax category, all this came in from the item class. The price came in, the last cost, and the default price. We jump back, we can see that, $15 and $27 respectively. And everything's starting to look good, so we can toggle activation, make them all active, and run the import. Now everything's done. You can see you have other options here. Clear all the activation checkboxes until an error. You can toggle processing. So again, I could turn all of these processed off or back on again. We can clear out our errors. Under history, it shows us all the different times we prepared and processed, the number of records that we imported. And under details, we have the info on the data provider. We can drill into it from here and the settings accordingly. And also the options to skip the headers. As you recall, the spreadsheet, the first row we treat as the column header. But in this case, we have the option to skip the header. You also have an option to just validate the data. So the system will process it and just validate it to make sure there's no errors. Also, you notice, rather than go back to the data provider, you can actually get the file here. So I can hit Get File. It gets downloaded into my browser. And if I open it up, you can see the spreadsheet. This is the data that we actually imported. But what I can do here is I can make a few changes. Let's say I want to add a widget. And give it a price or a cost and give it a price. I can save this, minimize, and upload that file version right back in, or drag and drop. We'll drag and drop here. Now if I go back and I hit prepare again, notice Acumatica gave me a new record with my cost and my price. So you can make quick changes to your spreadsheet and upload a new version. Now in this case, I didn't have an item SKU, but I can just add it here, save it. I'll toggle activation because all these other ones were already processed. So I'll just make this one active and I'll import. Now if I go back to my item profile, extra 0, you can see the widget item has been imported. A few last things here. Under import scenarios and new to 2020 R1, we have substitution lists. This gives you the ability to convert. This gives you the ability to have substitution lists with a number of different original values and substitution values. Later, you can use these inside as a script. So for example, in this particular substitution value, if I see ED Power, I want to change it to IND Exiles. These are two different vendor codes in our sales demo database. If I were importing that vendor ID, for example, and I were to open up one of these source field values, click the pencil here, you see at the bottom, in addition to all these different formulas, you see at the bottom there's something called substitution lists. I can use this substitution list to scrub for data and automatically replace certain field values. So this could be very helpful when you have a number of different values that you want to replace and you don't want to go through it one by one. Now you can see here, this is a whole video in itself, we have the ability to do different formulas. So we can take different values and use arithmetic, do logicals. So we can do conversions. For example, we could take a conditional. So if the value is equal to XYZ, then great, we'll use this value. Otherwise, we'll use this value. Similar to Excel, the if-then statement. But you can see there's a number of different formulas you can do. Here's the substitute list, substitute all, source field, substitute list. So these formulas and functions can be very, very helpful for configuring an import scenario that not only can get the data in with a lot of versatility, but also is an import scenario that you can lean on for a long time. So earlier I mentioned how you can make this import scenario visible in the user interface. And in doing so, it would allow end users to maybe use this import scenario on a regular basis. Maybe you're importing orders on a regular basis. If we go into import scenario, there's an option here, process import scenarios. And what this does is it shows you all of your import scenarios. It gives you the ability to fire a bunch of them at a time. You could select these, hit process all. And here's the operation we're doing. If you recall, these are the different operations that were in our import by scenario. This is a single transaction, but this allows us to do multiple import scenarios. But on top of that, we can schedule this to run maybe daily. So your imports can run in the background in Acumatica, and this screen will show you the status of them. It'll show you the number of records that were imported, when it was prepared, and when it was last completed. Now, the next question you might have is, well, Greg, how do I have dynamic data? Meaning, if I'm going to import every day, how do I get a new spreadsheet or new file into the mix so that it makes sense to do an import every day? So if we go back to our data provider and we take a look at our file, we'll click on Files, and notice this is the file that we uploaded. We uploaded a new version minutes ago. If we click Edit, this is our Document Manage File Maintenance screen. Shows information about the file that we've uploaded. It also shows different versions, so you can have multiple versions. You can have different articles and entities, access rights. You can check it out. There's a number of different options here. But specifically, the synchronization option is very useful. So if we click Synchronize, this gives us the ability to have Acumatica automatically update this file based on an FTP, HTTP, or a shared folder, or a secure FTP. So when you select these options, you can put in your path, your credentials, and Acumatica will synchronize the folder content with all of these options. So you could run this schedule, maybe at 6 o'clock in the morning, get your latest file from an FTP site, then run your import shortly thereafter, and Acumatica will take this brand new file from our data provider over to the import scenario and run the import. So this can be very useful for running imports on a regular basis with little or no input. Now, to get this to synchronize, there's a menu option called File Synchronization. And if you have any set up here, you'll see them across the board. And again, process file, all files. You can select the ones you want or process all of them. Or there's a scheduler here, and you would schedule this right before you do your import. Additionally, notice it's not just about importing, it's also about exporting. So if you have any data that you want to push to an FTP site, that's also possible here. Instead, you do an export scenario. We'll cover exporting data in another video. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching, and have a great day.